Okay, so we all know what Firebase is. We all know what Supabase is. They're sort of at odds. They're kind of in competition. And people love to say that Supabase is like a Firebase killer, that it's the better alternative of the two and that you should use Supabase. But Firebase recently came out with their new product called Firebase Data Connect, which allows you to basically use a SQL database, but through some Firebase magic to be able to have it better interact with your application. And they do this as an alternative to Firestore. So let's see if it's actually up to par with Supabase and if it can actually replace it and essentially be the killer that I'm sure that the Firebase team and Google really wants it to be. So as far as getting it set up, what you're going to do, or what their documentation kind of pushes you in the direction of doing, is using their VS Code plugin. I think they have some plugins maybe for other IDEs out there, but the VS Code plugin basically will end up looking something like this. It'll end up looking something like this. You'll log into your account through their Firebase plugin or Firebase Data Connect plugin. And then you'll be able to start the emulator through there. You'll be able to add SDKs to the app through there. More on that a little bit later. And you'll be able to deploy to production. More on this later though, but when you install that plugin in VS Code, it basically tries to get you to set up, like it tries to set up everything for you and kind of take care of everything for you. And this is fine. I personally just didn't really like interacting with the plugin in my own testing of this. I would much rather do things through the CLI because I already live in the terminal a lot. I don't really want to use the mouse. So if you simply run your normal like Firebase init command, it'll basically take you through the normal process of initializing a new Firebase project. And one of the options that you can choose is to have Data Connect be set up. And if you do that, it'll walk you through a few different options. It'll set everything out for you, and you'll basically get to the same point that you were if you would install the plugin. You also don't have to install the plugin for any like deployment or anything like that. We'll talk about that in a little bit, but I don't know. Plugin seems pretty optional to me. Something that I want to talk about though are some fundamental concepts that kind of are really important in the world of Firebase Data Connect. So the first thing that we want to understand is this thing called a service. So we have three things. We have a service, we have a schema, and then over here we have a connector. And a service, you can have as many of those in your Firebase project as you want, okay? Think of a service as being like an API. If you've ever worked with like microservices or something like that, it's basically what this is. You're creating a new API or a new service that's probably going to be specific to a domain or a stakeholder perspective or something like that, probably a domain. And then a schema exists really within a service. So we have these two things here. We can only have one schema, and a service gets connected to a Cloud SQL instance, specifically a database within the Cloud SQL instance. But we'll just keep it this way for right now, okay? Now, you can only have one schema per service, all right? One schema per service. Now, a collection is, or sorry, a connector, sorry. A connector is basically a collection of queries and mutations. So GraphQL queries and mutations that basically are things that your application can do. So for example, if you have a web app, you would create a connector for the web app, and then it would generate everything, and it would basically be allowed to do those things against the schema, and which ultimately talks to that Cloud SQL instance, right? Now, you can have multiple connectors per service. So let's say that we had a marketplace. You could have a connector for, let's say, sellers in your marketplace, and then you could have a connector for normal users, aka buyers, in your marketplace. And you'd be able to kind of separate them out. So they get run against the same service, but you'd be able to separate them out. Maybe you have, I don't know, multiple applications or something like that. Like maybe there's a web app where only the sellers can log into. Maybe there's a mobile app where or everyone can log into, or whatever. I don't know, however you had architected it. But basically, you have multiple connectors, and they each have a specific sub-selection of queries and mutations that you can perform against the schema, which ultimately is kind of talking to that that Cloud SQL instance. Now, I've drawn it out this way kind of on purpose, because what we're actually going to do is now we're going to have multiple services. So you can have multiple services within your Firebase project. So this would be kind of like a microservices architecture where perhaps you have multiple APIs that kind of are relevant to different domains. So maybe there's something for authentication. Maybe there's something for creating products. Maybe there's something for creating posts in a blog or something like that, right? And they're all their own services. So it's kind of like a microservice, right? So really, this ends up living out here. Something that's interesting though is that, let's say we want to go and create another service. Now we want to have a simple service, and this is for, let's say, a service for products. And let's say that we have another service for like blog posts or something like that. So we could do that. We could have the blog, right? Now, we would need somewhere to store this, so we could do this. You could create another SQL instance that's totally separate, right? Or you can also share the SQL instance. Either way, you can do either one. They're both valid. It just kind of comes down to how you want to architect your system. But you can do both things with Data Connect. So there's definitely some power behind this where you're not just thinking of data objects and being able to query for them. You're also actually creating an API. Like the Data Connect service is actually creating an API for you behind the scenes that it then allows you to interact with, but in a somewhat limited way. And we'll talk about that. So let's take a look at creating a data model. This is the example that they put on their website. And we're basically going to be looking at some sort of a movies database. So we have movie, and then we have movie metadata. Ultimately, what we're looking at here is we're going to have a table called movie, which I think ends up being movies. And then we'll have a table called movie metadata. And this is, I think, actually really cool because it is GraphQL. And so what this means is, let's say you were to go and move this somewhere else because it's all GraphQL. Like, let's say you didn't want to use Data Connect anymore. Because it's all GraphQL, in theory, you'd be able to just take this along with you and just kind of go, right? And I think that's really, really awesome. Something like Prisma is using its own essentially like a DSL to be able to create the schema for you using whatever language they came up with. And there's nothing wrong with that, but you're a bit more locked into the Prisma model that gets created, all the tables, all the relations that get generated as a result of that DSL and how they translate it into SQL commands. Whereas this, it's just GraphQL. However, while that seems really great, you might notice here some custom directives. And actually, this is a really basic one. There's actually other directives that look to be custom made by the Firebase team that actually abstract away a lot of logic, which kind of has me thinking that even though this is just GraphQL, whatever they're doing behind the scenes to interact with the Data Connect service or system is ultimately going to end up meaning that it's actually quite a bit of vendor lock-in, because you can actually see what this translates to. You can definitely see that, and I'll show you that in a second. However, there is still hidden logic that they're taking care of for you, which that's proprietary, and so we don't have that. So unless you can kind of like reverse engineer that on your own, you might end up being stuck with this, which I think is not that fun. Now, I will say though, that Firebase has done a really great job, in my opinion, of creating some reference documentations for how to use GraphQL with their system. So here's that. We're taking a look at that right now. And there's a lot of stuff here. So two that I wanted to call out on the directives are, one, this auth thing. So this actually allows you to apply permissions to the underlying data based on queries and mutations. And I think that's like actually pretty awesome that you can do that. Now, I don't believe they have like row level permissions here yet. They do have that as a request, like a user request that I saw. They use a site called User Voice, and I did see that as a request there, which I thought was really cool, and something that would add a lot of power once they do that. However, it doesn't appear to be there just yet. And they have some query reference and stuff. And I thought this was all pretty good, like pretty good stuff. You can definitely do a lot with it. I think you can probably create, 99% of the data models that you would need to, if not 100% of the data models you would need to. So I mentioned just before that you can go and actually see like the SQL that this creates. So let's actually take a look at that. So if I do Firebase, I'm just going to use the CLI here, right? Firebase Data Connect, SQL diff. Now we should see what we're going to get. Okay. This is essentially what's going to be run. We're going to get create table public, so public schema, movies, and then ID field, genre field, image URL field, title field with a primary key on the ID field. Okay, fantastic. Then we get this this metadata thing here, and we get an ID, movie ID. Okay, that goes back to this movie here. And as you can see down here, there's a constraint. There's a constraint on movie data, movie ID, foreign key, which goes to movie ID. So we are saying that our column in this table, movie ID, is going to reference public movie dot or ID, not dot. There's no dot, but reference ID. And then on delete cascade, which means that whenever this one is deleted, a movie is deleted, we will also delete the metadata. Yeah, cascading deletes are fun. Okay, so, and then we just kind of have some other stuff in there on metadata. So this is essentially what's going to happen. And if we do this, if we run now migrate, and if we refresh our page up here, we will now have some tables, and we're going to talk about that in a second. But this is actually where I think it starts to get really interesting. Something that you kind of need to know about Firebase, if you've not already used it, is that they seem to have their own way of doing things. So, and it's a little bit different than what I think most software engineers kind of learn when they build an app or something like that. So what Firebase does is they try to give you SDKs that you can run directly on the front end in your app so that you don't have to have a backend. You don't need to build an API, right? And that's essentially what we're going to see happen here. So if I bring up, if we do generate over here, if we do this generate command, what we're going to get, that was fast. Oh, I might have already done it. What we're going to get here down here. So imagine that this entire folder is like a Firebase project. And then also it's not organized very well. Also in this folder is my like Next.js app. So inside of my Next.js app here, I then generated for the web some Data Connect stuff. And so we could go into app. Oh, maybe it should have been generated into app. I don't know. But we could go into app page, and then we could use this stuff here. So here's what that might look like if we were to do that. Once you have this stuff generated, let's say in here, in your app or wherever is appropriate, you would be able to run or write this code here to basically be able to go and call these functions that Firebase Data Connect has generated for you. So you don't have to go and create some API. You're just calling the necessary functions that they've generated for you. And in the case of using like a mutation or something, you're basically just doing this, where you're creating a movie, right? You would just go and execute mutation, create a movie reference, and that's pretty much it. You just go and create your movie by calling the functions that they've generated for you. So there's no hitting an API that you've created because they've done it for you. Part of that service that we talked about earlier was them creating the API that just takes care of all this stuff. Now, this is both good and bad. It's good because it takes a lot of time away from us. And that is, believe me, like an amazing thing. And if I wasn't just it depends on the project. Like sometimes you have a project where you need to move as quickly as possible. And in that case, I think that doing something like this is absolutely fantastic and you should definitely take advantage of it. However, if let's say you just want to nerd out and do some cool things, then maybe this isn't going to be the greatest because it's going to take away a lot of the work that maybe you actually find fun. That's possible too. An alternative to both of those two things, though, is let's say that the application or the system that you're building needs to allow external systems to interact with it. Then what do you do? In this case, like I guess you could generate it for them and then like hand them off the code. Like maybe that would work, but it seems like not a great idea and probably not the way it should work, and thus probably won't actually work as smoothly as you might hope. So what you would basically need to do then is have your own API that you expose to them in that case, right? And so to do that, Firebase will allow you to, there's a section here that says run privileged operations with the Firebase admin SDK. This is how you would do something like that. So within, let's say you're building like an Express.js app for your API. So within there, you would be able to write your own code and have your own queries that basically, in this case, this is the query, the other one was commented out. But you'd be able to write your own queries that could actually go and interact with the underlying database through Firebase Data Connect. So that's kind of how you would get around that and still be able to make use of the service if you needed your own API to expose to other people or maybe other apps that have already been built or that are already working or something like that. Within Firebase Data Connect, I generally have two big concerns. Let's do three concerns. One, it's a brand new service, and so it's just not going to be as mature as many of the other offerings out there already are. And so if you're okay with that, if you're doing something that's like not enterprisey or not maybe mission critical, then like by all means, if it's a hobby project that you've got some time to grow as Firebase Data Connect grows, then by all means. However, if you're not in that camp, know that it's not going to be as mature as something like another ORM would be, or just going and utilizing and interacting with your database directly using something like SQL, right? That's definitely something to keep in mind. Something else to keep in mind is that it is a bit pricey. So if we take a look at the cost page, the pricing page, we'll go somewhere on here is Data Connect. You get 250,000 operations. So a query is an operation. A mutation is an operation. So you get 250,000 operations for free. After that, it's $4 per million operations. Comparatively, that's pretty expensive to other options that don't charge you per operation. Like, let's say you use Prisma as your ORM, which is essentially what Firebase Data Connect is. It's like replacing the ORM and then doing some extra stuff to create like an API service for you. That's all it is, right? And granted, that's a lot. Like, that's definitely worth a lot. I don't want to discount that at all. But $4 per million is obviously quite a bit. I don't know. Is that cost worth it to you or not worth it to you to not have to go and maintain the service? Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. But also keep in mind that this is not the database itself. This is just Firebase Data Connect, which is simply just the connection layer between your application and the database. You still have to go and pay for a Cloud SQL instance, and that will run you. I will go to my most local thing, North Virginia. That will run you anywhere from $8, just over $8 per month, to, I don't know where the other set instances were. When you actually go and like get an instance, there's like set configurations that you can use, but either way, like you can end up spending potentially hundreds, if not thousands of dollars on the instance itself. So it's not just Firebase Data Connect. It's also the instance itself that you have to pay for. Whereas typically you're just paying for the instance and maybe the egress and ingress, which you're already paying for here anyway. Typically you're just paying for that compute, that server instance of the database, but not the actual ability to make queries and mutations against it, which here you are. And that, I think, is something worth noting. The other thing as well is vendor lock-in. So just generally speaking, anytime that you go and offload some sort of responsibility or liability or work in general to another service or anything for that matter, even a person, you're going to pay for it, right? And this is no exception. If you want this service, and genuinely, I do believe that you can make this, that this thing could be incredible. Like, I think it's very promising and I think it looks really cool. But you're going to pay for it. And one of the ways you might pay for it is not just in money, but rather in vendor lock-in. So if you were to use this service, it might be pretty difficult for you to go and actually migrate away from it come such a time when you want to, right? Versus if you had totally built your own API and you had written all of your custom SQL queries, not used an ORM, not used some connection thing like this, Firebase Data Connect, there would be no vendor lock-in because there's no vendor of any kind to be locked into, which in this case is not the case actually, quite the opposite. There is a vendor that you are going to be locked into, which is Firebase. Something else to consider too is the type of vendor lock-in. So like dealing with like data is a much more important and heavier thing to kind of have to work with. There's a lot more risk involved in doing any sort of migration from one database to another because you're always risking, even if you back it up, yeah, like that helps a lot, but like the risk of losing your data is never zero, right? However, contrast is, let's say you were to be using Firebase app hosting, which is their hosting service, and you wanted to migrate to Netlify, and then one day you wanted to migrate to Vercel. Like that, there's no risk of losing data there, and you can always just redeploy and point the user, like change the DNS and point the users back or the website back to where it was before, and you've not lost anything. Like maybe there was some frustrated users, but you can just say there was maintenance and like you haven't really lost anything. So whenever you're working with the data, the vendor lock-in carries much more weight than it does if you're just worrying about hosting or where your code is being executed. Not as much risk in those cases. But here, because it's data, and I think they probably know this, there's a much more higher chance that migrations are going to be harder, and so you're probably less likely to do it because you're locked into that vendor. The final question, like the big question here is, can this thing be a good alternative to Supabase? And the answer is yes. But that's not really the right question. The question is, should it be an alternative to Supabase? Personally, while I think that Data Connect is really, really cool, I probably won't use it. And that simply comes down to two things. Number one, on my Dev Cafe project, I want to do things a little bit more manually because I'm trying to use that project as a way to learn. So even though I want it to be built quickly so that other people can use it, I also want it to be something where I can learn. So I don't think I'm going to use it there. Number two is on my other startup or my main startup, I'm already locked into using Prisma and I don't really want to migrate anywhere. So on that note, like I'm not going to use it there, right? Think of Firebase Data Connect as a replacement for an ORM and no longer having to create the API, that backend API. Whereas Supabase isn't so much the ORM, it's more so like the managed SQL instance, as far as my understanding of it goes. So Supabase is more like Cloud SQL, except that they give you a lot of other amazing stuff that you can kind of put on top of it. Whereas Firebase Data Connect is like Prisma, Supabase, and like Express.js all wrapped up into one, basically. And so they're kind of different things, and it just really should depend on what your use case is and how you want to go about doing it. Do you want to do things a little bit more manually? Do you want to have the API completely abstracted away? If you don't want to have to worry about the API, then Data Connect is probably a good option for you. If you don't mind doing things more manually, then maybe it's not a great option for you. And ultimately, I think that if you already have a set way of doing it that you're comfortable with, honestly, I would say just go with that way. If you don't have a set way of doing things, then go look at Data Connect, right? Because it's not going to hurt you and it'll probably help you, especially if you already know how to use Firebase. It works really well with Firebase. And so I think, it would be maybe a great complement to what you're kind of already doing because it's not going to require you to think in a different way. It already fits the Firebase mold. Whereas if you're only accustomed to doing things the Supabase way or a different way, then maybe it would be kind of a learning curve or whatever. Maybe you'd be uncomfortable doing it that way. The other thing too is that Firebase might actually end up being more expensive in the long run. So that's another thing to consider. And then not only that, but the vendor lock-in factor. So yeah, like Supabase is all about being open source. Like that's their whole thing. They pride themselves on being an open source collection of open source tools to be able to provide a legit alternative to something like Firebase. Firebase doesn't make that promise. Their thing is all about proprietary working within the GCP, the Google Cloud Platform ecosystem. That's both a blessing and a curse because one, vendor lock-in, that's not fun. But two, the fact that you're then inside of the ecosystem where everything within in theory, everything within GCP is kind of at your fingertips as well, that it can be a huge advantage and one that you honestly might want to take a look at. So really, hopefully I hope that helped, and I hope it maybe helped you to think about, which direction to go in if you're trying to make this decision. But ultimately, it's just kind of weighing the pros and cons and seeing which one's right for you. So take care. See you in the next one.